World War II is remembered for tanks, planes, and mighty battles, but behind every campaign were the men who fought it. Among the most disciplined and determined were the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their story is one of endurance, sacrifice, and tragedy, a story often overshadowed by the larger events of the war. Japanese soldiers were shaped by the ancient Bushido code of the samurai. This code demanded loyalty, honor, and the belief that surrender was worse than death. From their earliest training, men were taught to obey without question and to sacrifice themselves if necessary. Many went into battle prepared not to survive, but to die for their emperor, whom they considered a living god. Life on the front was brutal. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, Japanese soldiers endured unimaginable conditions. Supplies ran dry, and hunger forced men to live on insects, roots, and rainwater. The jungle itself became both prison and battlefield, testing their endurance in ways their enemies could scarcely imagine. Yet they endured, driven by discipline and the will to keep fighting. On the Pacific Islands, soldiers carved out hidden bunkers, dug tunnels, and laid traps. Even when surrounded and hopelessly outnumbered, they refused to give in. Allied soldiers described them as some of the toughest opponents of the war. The islands may have been small, but the battles fought there were endless and savage. The spirit of sacrifice ran deep. Some soldiers carried out suicide missions, hurling themselves at tanks or rushing enemy lines in banzai charges. Others volunteered for kamikaze operations, giving their lives in explosive final acts. To them, death in service was not defeat, it was honor. Death was sacrifice, and sacrifice was life. Yet behind their ferocity, these soldiers were human. Letters home reveal men torn between loyalty to Japan and love for their families. Many wrote final words knowing they would never return. These fragile pieces of paper remain haunting reminders of the human cost of war. Daily rations grew scarce as the war dragged on. Soldiers survived on rice balls, dried fish, or pickled vegetables when supplies allowed, but starvation often followed. Men ate grass, bark, and anything they could find. Hunger became an enemy as fierce as any soldier. Most refused to surrender. Captured soldiers often carried shame for the rest of their lives. To them, surrender was worse than death, and countless chose suicide instead of capture. For those who survived as prisoners, the stigma of dishonor lingered long after the war had ended. Training for these men had been harsh from the start. Recruits endured brutal drills and punishments meant to break individuality and forge absolute obedience. Pain was preparation, and fear was erased. Training broke their bodies, but it built their resolve. Even after Japan's surrender in 1945, some soldiers refused to believe the war was over. In remote jungles, men stayed hidden for years, carrying out orders long after their country had laid down its arms. Some held out into the 1970s, loyal to commands given decades before. For them, the war ended on paper, but not in their hearts. The Japanese soldiers of World War II left behind a legacy of both fear and respect. They were feared by their enemies for their relentless will to fight. They were admired for their endurance and discipline. And they are remembered for their sacrifice, a sacrifice that carried immense tragedy. Their story is not only about war, but also about humanity tested in its harshest form. Their memory carries pain, but it also carries history. To understand them is to understand the cost of loyalty, the power of belief, and the depth of sacrifice. These were the soldiers of the emperor, men who fought, suffered, and endured in one of history's darkest wars.